Deep in the soil of Virginia and Tennessee, lying beneath battlefields that changed the course of American history, researchers have recently unlocked a biological time capsule that is fundamentally rewriting what we thought we knew about the people of the South. For over a century, historians have relied on letters, census records, and old portraits to reconstruct the identity of the mid-19th century Southerner. We thought we had a clear picture of who these men were, where they came from, and how their genetics flowed into the modern population. But as the field of paleogenomics has advanced, a team of geneticists and archaeologists decided to do something unprecedented. They extracted high-quality DNA from the remains of soldiers who fell in the 1860s and compared it directly to the DNA of hundreds of thousands of living individuals across the American South today. What they discovered did not just add a few footnotes to history, it sent a shockwave through the academic community. The genetic reality of the Confederate soldier is vastly different from the myth, and the way those genes have survived, adapted, or seemingly vanished in the modern era has forced us to reevaluate the very concept of Southern heritage. Today, we are peeling back the layers of the double helix to explore the incredible secrets hidden in the DNA of the Civil War. To understand why these results were so unexpected, we first have to look at the Old South as it existed in our history books. The traditional narrative suggested a very monolithic, British-dominated population, mostly Scots-Irish and English laborers who had been in the colonies for generations. But the DNA tells a story of incredible complexity. When scientists began sequencing the genomes of these soldiers, they found a level of genetic diversity that was completely undocumented in the military records of the time. They found markers that pointed toward high levels of Mediterranean ancestry, hidden pockets of Scandinavian lineage, and most surprisingly, a significant amount of genetic overlap with indigenous populations that many historians assumed had been completely displaced decades earlier. The blood that soaked these battlefields was far more international and complex than the uniforms would suggest. But the real shock came when this ancient data was overlaid with modern genetic heat maps. We have this idea that the South is a place of deep, unchanging roots, that the people living in a small Georgia town today are the direct, unmixed descendants of the people who lived there in 1860. However, the DNA comparison showed a massive genetic bottleneck that occurred in the late 19th century. Many of the most common genetic lineages found in the soldiers have almost no presence in the modern Southern population. It's as if a huge portion of that generation's biological legacy simply evaporated. Scientists are now trying to figure out if this was due to the immense scale of the conflict's toll, or if a massive, undocumented wave of migration in the 1870s and 80s completely replaced the genetic bedrock of the region. One of the most fascinating aspects of this study involves the concept of ancestry inflation. Many modern people in the South firmly believe, based on family lore, that they are the direct descendants of specific high-ranking officers or famous regiments. But when the DNA was analyzed, scientists found a massive disconnect. A significant percentage of those claiming pure Southern lineage actually possessed genetic markers that indicated their ancestors arrived in the United States well after the war ended, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. These families assimilated so thoroughly into Southern culture that within 3 generations, they had forgotten their actual origins and replaced them with a regional mythos. The DNA doesn't lie, and it shows that much of what we call Southern DNA today is actually a much younger, more global mixture than the public realized. Let's talk about the lost lineages. During the study, researchers identified several genetic haplogroups in the remains of the soldiers that are effectively ghost lineages today. These are specific sequences of DNA that were common in the mid-19th century but are now extremely rare. This suggests that the biological impact of the conflict was even more transformative than we imagined. It wasn't just about the loss of life. It was about the termination of specific family trees that had been in North America since the 1600s. When historians talk about the lost generation, they are usually talking about culture and labor. But for geneticists, the South represents a massive pruning of the American genetic bush. The people who survived and went on to have children in the 20th century represented only a small, specific subset of the original population's diversity. The study also delved into the health and physical traits recorded in the genome. By looking at the DNA, scientists could reconstruct the actual physical appearance of these men with terrifying accuracy. They found that the average soldier was far more malnourished and genetically predisposed to certain conditions than their modern counterparts. There was a high prevalence of markers for vitamin deficiencies and chronic stress, which are actually etched into the epigenetics of the remains. More interestingly, when comparing these markers to modern Southerners, they found that some of these survival genes, the ones that help the body store fat and survive on low-calorie diets, are still present and highly active today. This genetic echo of the starvation and hardship of the 1860s may be contributing to the modern health challenges faced by the region. The body remembers the trauma of its ancestors, and it passes those survival mechanisms down through the centuries. Another area that shocked the researchers was the evidence of hidden migrations. We often think of the Civil War as a fixed event between two steady populations, but the DNA of the soldiers showed that the Confederate Army was composed of people who were incredibly mobile. They found soldiers buried in Virginia who had genetic signatures linking them to recent immigrants from German principalities who weren't even listed on the arrival manifests. This suggests that the melting pot of America was churning much faster and more violently than the written records ever admitted. The idea of the native-born Southerner was in many cases a social construct that the DNA simply does not support. As the scientists moved their focus to the modern side of the comparison, they used massive databases to see how far the rebel DNA had traveled. They expected to find the highest concentrations in the Deep South. Instead, they found some of the strongest matches in the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain West. This points to a massive, forgotten exodus. After the conflict, hundreds of thousands of families who had been in the South for 200 years packed up and left, moving as far away as possible. They took their DNA with them, leaving the actual South to be repopulated by different groups. This means that a person in Oregon today might have a more authentic 19th century Southern genome than a person living in downtown Charleston. It's a total inversion of how we think about regional identity. The researchers also focused on the Y DNA, which is passed down from father to son. This is a very stable way to track lineages over hundreds of years. They discovered that a surprisingly small number of founding fathers are responsible for a huge chunk of the modern Southern male population. This founder effect usually happens in isolated island populations, not in a massive continental region. It suggests that there was a period of intense social and biological selection. Certain families became incredibly successful and prolific after the war, while thousands of other lineages were pushed to the margins or died out completely. When you look at the South today, you are essentially looking at the biological winners of a very harsh evolutionary lottery. But what about the Southern DNA that everyone talks about? The study actually found that there is no such thing as a Southern gene. Instead, the South is a genetic crossroads. The researchers found markers from every corner of the Atlantic world. They found traces of Spanish Canary Islanders, French Huguenots, and even North African pirates who had settled in the coastal regions. This diversity is what made the South unique, but it is also what the modern era has largely smoothed over. As businesses move south and the population becomes more homogenized, those unique local genetic fingerprints are being diluted. We are currently living through the Great Blending, where the last distinct traces of the 19th century genome are being folded into a generic national average. Historians were particularly shocked by the findings regarding the highland versus lowland populations. For years, it was believed that the Appalachian Mountain people were a distinct genetic group, separated from the plantation-heavy lowlands by geography and class. But the DNA showed almost no difference between the two. The mountain residents and the coastal elites were sharing a much more recent common ancestry than anyone expected. This suggests that the social barriers between the poor mountain folk and the wealthy planters were far more porous than the novels and movies of the period portrayed. People were moving, marrying, and mingling in ways that the census takers simply failed to capture. The study also looked at the ancestry of the soil. In certain parts of the South, the environment has preserved DNA in a way that allows us to see how it has changed over a very short period of time. They found that in just 5 generations, the average height encoded in the Southern genome increased significantly, not just because of better food, but because of heterosis, which is the genetic benefit of different groups mixing. The South went from a series of isolated, inbred pockets to a powerhouse of genetic mixing. This biological rebound is one of the reasons why the region survived the economic collapse after the war. The DNA was getting stronger even as the economy was in ruins. The most controversial part of the study, and the one that generated the most headlines, involved the presence of unexpected lineages in some of the most prominent Confederate families. The researchers found that several prominent figures whose descendants take great pride in their pure European heritage actually carried small but undeniable amounts of sub-Saharan African and indigenous American DNA. In the 19th century, these hidden ancestries were often suppressed or erased from the family tree due to the social laws of the time. But the DNA acts as a permanent record. It shows that the history of the South is a shared history, written in the blood of all its people. The boundaries we think existed between races and classes were frequently crossed, creating a population that is far and away more interconnected than the public narrative allows. This interconnectedness is perhaps the most important finding of the entire project. It proves that you cannot separate the DNA of the South into us and them. The researchers found that the average modern white Southerner has a much higher likelihood of having hidden multiracial ancestry than white residents in the North or the Midwest. This creates a fascinating paradox. The region with the most complicated history of division is actually the region that is most genetically unified. The results that shocked historians were essentially a reminder that the human story is always one of movement, survival, and the breaking of barriers. The technology used in this study, known as target enrichment, allowed the team to look at millions of specific locations in the genome. It's like being able to read every single word in a library rather than just looking at the titles of the books. This level of detail revealed that the soldiers were often much older or much younger than the official records stated. The DNA showed boys as young as 13 and men as old as 65, who had been recorded as 21-year-olds in the paperwork. This paints a picture of a desperate total conflict environment where the physical reality of the population was being pushed to the absolute limit. For the participants who volunteered their modern DNA for the study, the results were often life-changing. One man from Alabama, who had spent his life convinced he was of direct Irish descent from a specific Confederate officer, discovered he had 0 Irish markers. Instead, his ancestry was almost entirely West Asian and Sephardic Jewish. His ancestors had likely fled perplexion in Europe, moved to the South, and completely reinvented themselves as traditional Southerner to survive. This ethnic camouflage was a huge theme in the findings. The South was a place where you could be anyone, as long as you could convince your neighbors of your story. The DNA, however, is the one witness that can't be convinced of a lie. As we move toward a future where everyone has their genome on their phone, these shocks will become more common. We are entering an era of radical transparency. The legends we tell ourselves about our ancestors are being replaced by the hard data of the double helix. For some, this is a loss of a certain kind of mystery. For others, it is a liberation. It allows us to see our ancestors not as marble statues or black and white photos, but as real, breathing human beings who were just as complicated and mixed up as we are today. The Southern DNA study is a warning to anyone who thinks they can build a wall around their identity. Whether it's geography, war, or social laws, nothing can stop the flow of human genetics. The $800 million skyscraper in Chicago, and the empty forest in Saint Forest, 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 Louis, are monuments to things we failed to build or save. But the DNA of the Southern soldier is a monument that is still alive. It is moving through the veins of millions of people, changing and adapting with every new generation. It is a mega project of nature, and it is the only one that truly can never be empty or abandoned. In the end, the scientists concluded that the standard Southerner is a myth. The reality is a vast, beautiful, and often chaotic mixture of the entire world. The soldiers of the 1860s were not a monolithic group of the same blood. They were a collection of disparate people caught in a global transition. And the people living in the South today are not a stagnant remnant of the past. They are a dynamic, evolving population that is becoming more diverse every day. The DNA study didn't just shock historians because of what it found in the past. It shocked them because of what it predicts for the future. It predicts a world where the old divisions no longer make sense because we are all, quite literally, part of the same tree. This is the power of the genome. It bridges the gap between 1860 and today. It turns the silent, empty ground of a battlefield into a source of infinite information. It shows us that even when the buildings are gone, the money is lost, and the flags are put away, the biological legacy remains. It is the one thing that can't be dynamited or auctioned off. So, the next time you think about your heritage, remember that the story is much deeper than your last name or the place you were born. The story is written in a code that began thousands of years ago and will continue long after we are gone. The shock isn't that we are different. The shock is how incredibly, deeply connected we all are, through time, space, and the secret language of our DNA. As the researchers pack up their equipment, and the soil is returned to the quiet battlefields, the data remains. Millions of gigabytes of information that tell the true story of the American South. Not the story of politicians or generals, but the story of the laborers, the survivors, and the families who kept going when the world was coming apart. It is a story of resilience that is literally etched into the bone. And as we continue to sequence more remains and more modern sets of DNA, the picture will only get clearer. The past is not behind us, it is inside us, in every single cell. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the literal bloodline of history, where the most surprising results are the ones that remind us we are more than the labels we give ourselves.